My family mocked me for wanting a workshop. Now they beg for jobs, and I don't give them a thing. The day I told my family I wanted to open my own carpentry shop, I didn't get worried looks or respectful silence. I got laughter that clanged like hammer blows on a tin sheet. They told me pretty dreams belong in a box you take out on Sundays to sigh over, not in something that pays rent or groceries. They mocked me with that easy cruelty that appears when the person judging risks nothing, and I was left feeling like I'd brought a freshly sanded piece to the dining table just to have them use it as a cutting board. My obsession started in childhood. Furniture built with patience, tables that learn the weight of conversation, chairs that memorize the shape of your back, bookcases that treasure voices. I fell in love with the craft watching my grandfather, Ernesto, tame a rocking chair for my newborn sister. That's when I understood wood isn't just material, it's memory that breathes. It was obvious to me, to my family, it was a long joke to retell every Christmas. My uncle, full of after-dinner sarcasm, predicted I'd end up flipping burgers on a corner when money ran short. Yvonne, the cousin with the easy laugh, said I couldn't even assemble a toy without losing my temper. My mother stroked my cheek and asked when I planned to get serious. And my father, who once gave me a toolbox, dropped the line that hurt most. Big goals require big inheritances. I chose to keep quiet and work. I answered with sandpaper instead of speeches. I restored pieces salvaged from markets and thrift shops, learned to sell on my own, and endured a soul-sucking sales job just to save what I needed. I lived in a cold apartment with a kitchen turned into a mini shop, the smell of wood dust stuck to the curtains. Until, stubborn as an ant, I opened a shop and named it Wood Heritage, a place to build objects that outlast fashion's whims. Then came the twist. The voices that had laughed started knocking, disguised as praise and urgency. Suddenly, there were resumes in my inbox and sweet messages from people who'd recently been judges of my inevitable failure. At first, I thought the loudest sound in my life would be the saw biting into peroda or the firm tap of a hammer driving old nails. I quickly discovered the real noise came from voices that used to mock me and now showed up with tight smiles. One evening, while yellow light turned the peroda golden, I heard hesitant steps behind me and a voice trying to sound casual. It was Laura, the cousin who one Christmas had passed judgment on my craft by calling it a romantic hobby. She wore a wrinkled dress, a tired purse, and carried the unease of someone unsure whether the door would fully open. She asked for a job with the honesty of a person who isn't asking for pity. Her voice showed a dignity scuffed by hard days, and in her eyes was something I hadn't seen the night of the jokes. Hunger for purpose. I told her I had no openings, though I did need someone for finishing work. Caution won out. She nodded in silence while I went back to sanding, trying not to confuse help with a lifeline for someone who once pushed me under. She left behind the certainty she'd be back, like a faint scent you recognize before you can name it. That night, as I was closing up, I got a message from Ruben, my middle school teacher who taught me to respect detail. He'd recommended my work to someone special. I didn't think much, said sure, pass along my contact. And the next day, the phone rang with a clear, steady voice introducing herself as Teresa Valdivia. She wanted a complete dining set, Mexican hardwood, a tight deadline, and total trust in my criteria. I hung up with my pulse racing, a mix of fear and joy. It wasn't just my biggest commission. It was freedom to design without training wheels. I spent the night sketching, thinking about proportions, grain, strong character legs, invisible fasteners, honest finishes. When the glass turned blue at dawn, my hands were smeared with graphite and my head was full of decisions. While I cleared my desk, an anonymous message slid in and chilled the back of my neck. A single line claiming that table would never be finished. I didn't know whether to laugh or worry. I chose to work slower and cleaner. I called Ruben to thank him, and he, with his sober humor, reminded me wood demands respect, and good work shows in years, not the next day. I opened my sketchbook and let the idea breathe Mexico without dressing it up as a postcard. I imagined a peroda top with a live edge, A-frame legs inverted with a floating stretcher, joinery that looked simple but hid the rigor of well-planned unions. The chairs would be slender, their backs winking at Ernesto's rockers. My childhood lessons turned into a whisper. Teresa called to invite me to her home in Coyoacán and asked me to study the dining room light, the distance to the kitchen, the everyday life that table would hold. I went with my sample kit, a laser, a measuring tape, and a portfolio of small space work. She greeted me with elegant restraint and a line I'd only fully grasp later. She wanted time, not trend. We measured, talked, walked the room. She pointed at a knot and told me not to hide it. Knots, she said, tell stories. She spoke of long after-dinner conversations, kids who tend to linger, old portraits with severe looks that never learn to relax. She asked where my wooden mania came from and, when she heard Ernesto's name, nodded as if a gear had clicked. As we said goodbye, she added one more charge. You're not selling me a dining set. You're building me a place for hard conversations. I left with my chest on fire. Few people name so precisely what you've been trying to make without knowing how to say it. On the way to Xochimilco, where Don Lupe stores slabs like vintage bottles, I decided the table had to bear secrets without breaking. I chose firm Perota, wide grain, kiln-dried, and unhurried so the panel wouldn't warp at the climate's first mood swing. The slab's weight pushed my shoulders down and anchored me to the ground. A reminder, what matters is heavy. Back at the shop, as I parked, I saw Yvonne crossing the street with his usual crooked smile. He walked in uninvited, cracked jokes wrapped in fake camaraderie, and asked, all faux innocent, if I didn't need a manager. Remember, if you like these stories, subscribe to the channel and ring the bell. I told him we don't sell air here. We charge for work, and there are no manager gigs for selfie poses. He insisted on looking at the plans and asked for a photo to show off, which I calmly refused. He left wearing a smirk that ended in shadow. I took a deep breath, like letting a draft you didn't invite pass through, and locked back in. Ruben stopped by with pot coffee and eyes that could see a bevel 10 years out. He corrected me by 2 millimeters, reminded me not to over-tighten the clamps, and repeated his usual lesson. Wood doesn't sign contracts with haste. In a slip, I nicked my thumb with a chisel. Nothing serious, just enough to relearn moving forward without arrogance. That bandage became a chatty little teacher. At night, I played low boleros and talked to the slab like Ernesto used to with his pieces. Promises of patience and high standards at once. I set the clamps of the main glue up, cross-battened against the grain, and used cauls to fight cupping. I was stubborn and patient, a mix that, in carpentry, looks a lot like faith. As I was leaving, the phone lit up with a name that hadn't appeared in days. Laura. She called to ask for a chance. No frills, with words that didn't smell like pity, but like resolve. She'd spent years doing finishes and oils, wet sanding and polyurethanes. She didn't beg, she committed. I told her I'd test her on one condition, absolute punctuality. Laura showed up at the exact time with a metal kit that jingled like craft. Her gaze was serious, and her hands were ready to get dirty for the grain's sake. I had her start with medium grit, by hand, so we could hear ourselves work. Her rhythm was steady. Her breathing matched the raspy sound that's always calmed me. The warm hiss of living wood that lets itself be stroked. I jumped into cutting the inverted A-legs, counting angles in my head, my back tight to avoid drift. She asked how many hours I planned to put in. I told her as many as it took. I expected the same from her. She nodded. We took a minimal break for a roll with beans and a glass of water. She smiled, saying she missed feeling proud of what her hands did. The day carried us through primary sanding and prep for joinery. Toward closing time, Teresa called to confirm progress and announce a visit the next day. I hung up feeling the weight of her trust like an extra clamp. She wasn't buying a piece of furniture. She was betting on a place where time would have a voice. Teresa arrived with watchmaker punctuality. She touched the top, pointed at a knot, and asked that it remain visible. She glanced at Laura with brief curiosity and left us a crystal-clear note. I trust you, but don't confuse trust with patience. When she left, Laura let out the nervous laugh of someone who's discovered a look can make you sweat more than a blowtorch. The week was a whirlwind. Hidden tenons, well-spread PVA, checking for square, nights rechecking measurements. At closing one evening, I heard a thud outside. One freshly cut leg lay on the floor with a crack that had no business being there. It wasn't an accident. Someone had left a clumsy signature. My stomach knotted. I decided to reinforce the doors and our habits. Before dawn, another nameless message came. A curt warning promising the next one wouldn't be a leg. My head buzzed with that silent alarm that won't let you fully sleep. At sunrise, I checked locks, hinges, and bevels. Nothing forced. Just a cracked piece and a fatigue that didn't come from manual labor. Laura walked in with dark circles and resolve. She suggested installing cameras and keeping the shop from becoming a sieve for nosy folks. I listened and went out to buy a double lock set and a basic camera kit. I wasn't flush with cash, but I had more than enough reasons to stop guessing at shadows. We went back to work with the discipline of tuning an instrument before the concert. Mid-afternoon, Yvonne showed up with comments wrapped in politeness. He talked about family rumors, demanding clients, and admin help I hadn't asked for. I watched him approach the reference folder, and his expression tightened when he saw the last photo, a man from another time, stern portraits, and in the corner a boy who seemed to carry his surname in his features. He asked where I'd gotten it. I said from Teresa, and he left with a quiet door slam. That image kept nibbling in my memory. At night, on the computer, I dove into archives and found an old note with the name Aurelio Valdivia beside a collection of wooden dining tables. The photograph confirmed what my eyes had suspected. That boy wasn't a stranger to our story. Next day, Teresa asked for progress photos and reminded me, soft but firm, that the table had to hold hard conversations. While we tightened clamps, Yvonne barged in again, brushed his hand over the top, and dropped another sharp line. Nice, if you finish it. Laura faced him head-on. He said nothing, just left the echo of footsteps that know exactly where they're going. We closed early to gather our thoughts. The silent shop made more noise than a market. Some quiets reverberate. That night, reviewing the footage, I saw a man in a cap walk past the door and linger long enough to raise every hair on my arms. His face wasn't visible, but the slight sway in his gait looked too much like Yvonne's. I decided not to tell Laura until I had more than a hunch. In the morning, the sealer lit the grain as if it turned on a landscape. The knots deepened, and every brushstroke brought us closer to delivery, and to a truth we didn't yet know how to name. Then Teresa sent a note. She'd stopped by with her son, Rodrigo, to see the progress herself. I said I'd be ready and staged the shop like a set before a show. Rodrigo walked in wearing a light suit and an auditor's gaze. He scanned the room, offered dry comments and long silences. He paused at the folder, looked at the boy's photo, and recognition crossed his face without pretense. Not surprise, memory. He asked where it came from, and, hearing it was from his mother, closed it slowly and added a warning. If a certain visitor shows up, don't open the door. After they left, Laura dropped her brush and pinned me with a look. You're hiding something. I told her about the camera and the shadow with the cap. She said caution without proof is wise, but other people's fear won't pay our deadlines. We worked late, focused like people walking along boards with the nails pointing up. That same night, when I got home, I found a photo slid under my door, taken from inside the shop. The half-polished table, the slanting light, our effort captured by hidden eyes. The cold I felt wasn't from the weather. It was knowing someone had been close enough to hear even the silence. At first light, I rushed back, checked locks and corners, and found the side storage room gaping like a poorly shut mouth. Among old boards, a fresh cigarette, but I couldn't pin on any regular. Laura listened to me tell it with forced calm. She answered with the seriousness of someone who knows the game stopped being a game, and suggested we finish the top coat and final assembly as soon as possible. The tung oil blended with wax raised a warm scent that smelled like a well-kept home. The chairs took on a soft sheen, the joints were splinter-free, and the top began reflecting light as if it breathed. We hardly spoke, but every pass of the cloth was an answer to the invisible pressure around us. Teresa came in without warning, circled the table, and said it was turning out as she'd hoped. She asked, again, that the table be able to hold what glass never can, and to be careful who touched it before it reached her house. When she left, Laura murmured that Teresa knew more than she said. I nodded because, deep down, I felt it too. That night we heard a thud at the entrance and found a wooden box with a split piece of Perota inside and a note nailed through the center with words that sounded like a threat's motto. Not everything you build is made to last. We decided to finish the next day, no matter what. The deadline was shrinking like fabric in hot water. While packing, Teresa called asking to move delivery up by a day. It didn't sound like a request. It sounded like a tightening clock. I agreed, knot in my throat and all. Laura asked who'd be at the house that day. I didn't know. All I could promise was that the table would be where it belonged, like the pieces that carry unspoken weight. Morning broke with that dense quiet that announces decisions. I finished securing the corners of the crate and went down my checklist like each box was a vow. Joints, level, micro scratches, finish uniformity, edge protection. Laura moved at my pace, the kind of focus you learn when an unsure hand can ruin weeks of work. Outside, the street ran its routine, but inside we knew any loose detail could leave us exposed again. Before noon, the doorbell announced an unexpected visit. A messenger in discreet attire, the kind you don't notice until you look twice, left an envelope with my name and walked off without a word. Inside, a typed sheet with an address and a time, the same ones Yvonne had slipped me the day before, now with a brief line that felt like an ultimatum. If you want this to end quietly, be there. The tone was so cold it warmed the back of your neck. Laura watched me close the envelope and didn't ask questions. By then, she knew words in this business tended to arrive late. We stuck to the plan, finished protecting the table, load it carefully, and I'd go to that meeting with the same composure you carry into a room where the floorboards creak. No room for theatrical improvisation, only discreet decisions. I spent the afternoon tightening straps and adding extra padding to exposed areas. The top was flawless. The inverted A-legs hugged the stretcher with the affection of well-thought joinery, and the wax gave the Perota a glow without vanity. Every prior coat, every sanding, every pause had built more than a piece of furniture. It had built the backbone we'd need for whatever came next. When we switched off the lights, the shop breathed like a big, calm animal ready to move at dawn. I slipped a recorder into my inside jacket pocket without overthinking it. It wasn't morbid curiosity, it was survival instinct. If I knew anything, it was that it holds voices, and sometimes it's smart to have proof of what can't be explained with scattered words. I went to the address walking like someone who doesn't want to cast noise or a shadow. The same old gate, an older man with manners from another century. Inside, the room smelled like well-kept leather and papers in boxes unopened for decades. Yvonne was there, paler than usual, and the man from the photographs, now carrying time across his shoulders, looked at me the way you size up a new tool before you put on the bench. The exchange was shorter than I'd imagined, but it cut deep. He spoke of power like he was listing with species, densities, resistance, weight, grains that deceive. He told me not to underestimate the table's importance, that well-built places make it easier to decide things others don't want to face. He reminded me, without raising his voice, that there are names best left unspoken because they splinter in the wrong mouth. There were no threats, only that dry, level-headedness that grabs you by the collar of understanding. Yvonne avoided my eyes almost the whole time. When he finally spoke, his teeth were clenched like someone who'd already said yes to something he wished he'd refused. He asked me to finish the job and forget about uncovering connections that weren't mine to trace. I didn't respond with bravado. I just dipped my chin. Sometimes the strongest wood is the kind that doesn't creak. I left feeling I'd pressed a finger into a live grain, still drawing itself. The night was thick, and the city sounded like footsteps I didn't want to recognize. I walked a couple of blocks before letting myself breathe. I repeated a simple promise. Deliver flawlessly. Listen only to what's necessary. And slip out with the same discretion as the first light entering a workshop window. Back at the shop, Laura waited among boxes and straps. I told her the bare minimum, enough to know we hadn't been building just wood. With the practical calm she's learned while sanding, she said our best defense would be a perfect, on-time delivery. We slept little, and what little we slept sounded like oil soaking into fibers, the noise that always helped set my heart back in place. Delivery day was all engines and measured breathing. We carried the table like someone who's earned the right not to touch the ground. The straps were tight without choking. Blankets hugged the top with stubborn gentleness. The drive to Kokon passed without music or chatter, like a ritual that demands silence out of respect. Rodrigo waited at the door, posture mixing oversight and suspicion. He led us down the hallway, cleared the dining room, and we unpacked with the patience of undressing a relic. When the light hit the perota and lit up the knots, the room turned into a pleasant echo. Teresa stepped closer, rested her hand, listened with her fingertips, and said the two words that validate months of work. It's ready. I adjusted a couple of chairs and aligned the table with the light's axis, just as my measurements called for. I wanted to leave as soon as everything was right, but the movement of people arriving, hushed greetings, and clocks ticking in unison told me the meeting was about to start. I remembered the recorder in my pocket and the anonymous instruction, "Don't intervene, just listen." There weren't many people, but each presence weighed like a mahogany armoire. Few, but heavy. The voices started cordial and gradually warmed to that tone you hear when someone's setting the stage for something delicate. I caught words about consolidation, shortened timelines, names I preferred not to fix in memory, and one offhand remark that chilled my back. Anyone who disagrees will find they don't have a chair at this table. I didn't look for Yvonne, but his name surfaced without him speaking. Someone else confirmed it, as if a hand had been raised from afar. Surrendering your own control leaves that shadow in other people's voices, a burr that scrapes the wood. I finished the adjustments, told Teresa everything was set, and heard her final line, the one that still echoes when I close my eyes. Glass tables don't hold secrets. Wooden ones never forget. I left with a pulse slower than my hurry deserved, careful not to drop a single screw of my composure. Driving back felt like navigating with a borrowed compass. The city seemed to have extra corners, and every light asked me to remember what I'd heard without pretending I understood it all. In the passenger seat, the used packing from the chair adjustments watched me with paper eyes. At the shop, Laura had coffee ready, and that look that only leaves once you answer the question she hasn't yet formed. I told her the essentials, the mood, the density, how some silences weigh more than speeches. She listened, arms crossed, nodding when I said it was no longer our concern. The table was delivered, the invoice would be paid, and we needed to keep our door shut and the cameras on. I put the recorder away without playing it. Between curiosity and prudence, I chose prudence. Not out of fear, but out of respect for the decision we'd made when we accepted the job. Some things don't need to be heard twice to be confirmed. I checked tools, powered down machines, and for the first time in days felt the shop reclaim its usual scent, that warm wood perfume that never offends. That night, finally still, I thought of Ernesto and Ruben, how both always spoke of craft as a mix of rigor and humility. I also thought of Teresa, of her precise request, and how a piece of furniture can become a stage for conversations that fit nowhere else. Wood Heritage was a name I chose out of romance, but from that day on it also became a reminder of boundaries. I slept in fragments, dreaming I kept sanding the same stubborn edge. At dawn, the first ray found a clean bench and a clear auxiliary top. No packing scraps left, and that emptiness, far from scaring me, returned my sense of control. Nothing belongs to me more than the work my hands embody. Everything else, even when it brushes up against you, passes. The following days were a careful return to a different normal. New inquiries started coming in, some from regulars, others from people who'd heard about the Coyoacán dining table and wanted something like it, but unique. I replied politely with a tougher filter than before, asking what the piece was for, what story it needed to hold, what limits they were willing to respect. If someone dodged those questions, I dodged the project. Laura officially became my partner. It wasn't a festive act, but a decision written in hours spent sanding, measuring, and staying quiet together when silence served us. We signed modest papers, split responsibilities, and set a rule that sounds simple but takes discipline. Say no when the shine shows up without purpose. A shop also protects itself with no's. Yvonne disappeared for a while I couldn't measure, if not for the absence of a shadow on the sidewalk. Family rumors swirled, as always, but nobody brought jokes wrapped in smiles this time. The group chats, once so quick with mockery, stayed formally silent, almost professional. The calm suited me. I had enough to do keeping my boards and my schedule orderly, without uninvited interpreters. One morning a message from Rodrigo arrived, dry, concise, almost administrative. He thanked me for the table and said it was still perfect. I didn't reply. There was nothing to add without inviting that conversation in through the back door, and I planned to keep that door locked. I deleted the message like dust blown off a shelf. I prefer empty. That same day, at the bottom of an oil box, I found the recorder I'd stored without listening. I held it a moment, as if it weighed more than aluminum, and put it back in a locked drawer. I realized some evidence is kept not to use, but to remind yourself there was a line you drew and chose not to cross. In carpentry and in life, clear lines prevent clumsy cuts. The next commission smelled of everyday life again. A console for a narrow entryway, a low bookcase for a room with afternoon sun, a bed with a slatted headboard where the grain could tell a story without distractions. The tenderness of tasks that steady your breathing and bring your pulse back to a rhythm that doesn't rob you. Laura and I split the work with the ease that comes from shared learning. Sometimes between sandpaper and oils, our talk drifted to that table and back again. It surprised us how an object can change how you understand your craft. We no longer accepted rush-borrowed timelines or sketches that disguised vanity. What is honest when you let it be? Hurry makes it a liar and makes us accomplices. We chose clients who value time and ran from those who buy noise. Ruben kept showing up with his thermos and millimeter corrections. I told him just enough, and he, wise from years of watching tables bear more than plates, only raised his eyebrows. He reminded me the craft is bigger than we are, but it's on us to protect the shop like a small country with clear laws. I couldn't say it better. The shop felt more ours than ever. We rearranged tools, installed better lighting over the main bench, and set up a finishing corner where clients could touch without intruding. We opened a notebook to record details. Time tends to smudge, which oil each kind of Peroto liked, which sandpaper obeyed certain knots, which glue behaved best with the city's fickle humidity. At night, I sometimes stayed a few minutes alone. No music, wrapped only in the scent of warm wood. I didn't chase grand phrases or pompous morals. It was enough to remember that when outside voices were noise, the only answer that worked was putting my hands on the piece and continuing. The rest, including lists of names I never asked for, had to stay outside, where dust falls and gets swept away. It wasn't all calm. Some days the old unease knocked again, disguised as anonymous messages, though each time with less force. The difference was that now the shop was better braced from within. New locks, working cameras, stronger habits, and an invisible net made of trust among the people inside. Laura learned to spot noises that don't belong to Wood's language and to answer with her chin up. One afternoon, while we tested a matte finish on a shelf, Yvonne peeked around the doorframe without stepping in. Something in his posture had changed, less inclined to sharp jokes, more to short sentences. He said he came to say hi. He'd been away. He wasn't staying. I listened with a mix of caution and old affection, the kind that survives, stumbles without vanishing, even if it never goes back to the same. He apologized in his way, without calling it an apology. He admitted he'd played at feeling important in conversations bigger than him, and that, in that game, he scared himself. I didn't ask for details or names. It wasn't my drawer to open. I offered him a glass of water. He downed it in 2 gulps and left, promising not to cross any door he wasn't invited through. Laura looked at me without speaking. We both knew the parenthesis had closed cleanly, and that didn't turn what we'd lived into a light anecdote. In some crafts, time heals. In ours, it also teaches you to accept that the most beautiful grains often come from tension. The point isn't to erase them, but to understand them and, when possible, leave them visible, just like Teresa asked that day. That night, while I noted the results of a wax oil mix we'd tested, I realized the most valuable thing that job left us wasn't a paid invoice or discreet mentions that brought clients with good eyes. It was a map of decisions we could now read without shaking. When pushy voices show up, we know exactly which one to answer with. Over time, Wood Heritage became a small refuge for people who wanted pieces with no hurry. Couples came who debated chair heights like they were negotiating a treaty. Parents and kids who wanted a table to practice talking without phones. Die-hard readers looking for bookcases that wouldn't collapse under the avalanche. Every commission taught us another way to hold hard conversations. On one visit, Ruben suggested a short class for young people who wanted to learn wood by listening. I built a hands-on program where the first lesson was to smell, touch, find the grain's direction, and respect it. If you learn to listen to the material, you end up hearing yourself better. At the end of each session, someone asked about the Coyoacán table, and I answered with a smile that says a lot without naming things. Social media kept moving, but we changed our tone. Less easy shine, more process. Photos of hands, clamps, pencil lines humbly correcting other lines. Fewer explosive reactions, more messages from people who value what isn't obvious at first glance. That small community grew roots, not gusts. Sometimes in the shop's quiet, I thought of Teresa and the phrase she left us like a standing order. Build places for hard conversations. I started writing it on the first page of new notebooks, a starter's motto, not to overblow the craft solemnity, but to remember why it's worth saying no to anything dressed up as honorable hurry. Laura began designing a seat-testing bench with tiny variations in angle and lumbar support. We laughed at how a single degree changes a dinner's patience. Those details, often called quirks, are the difference between a piece that pushes you to flee and one that invites you to stay. Maybe, without meaning to, we learned hospitality. One ordinary morning, a short letter arrived announcing the death of the older man whose shadow had crossed our story. It didn't come from immediate family, but from a firm that seems to close chapters discreetly. The note was dry, hinting that parts of his collection would sit in storage indefinitely. I didn't feel relief or sorrow, just the stillness that follows a distant thunderclap. The news rekindled questions I'd already decided not to chew on, so I focused on a special commission. A small table for a woman who wanted to invite her sisters to talk again after years apart. She asked for warm wood, soft edges, legs that don't get in the way, and a finish that could handle spilled coffee and tears. Designing it, I rediscovered what it means to put 4 legs and a top at the heart of a room. In the process, Laura suggested leaving 2 knots visible in the corner where the afternoon light falls most kindly. She said well-treated wounds become beautiful. When the client saw it, she cried with relief. Not because the piece was gorgeous, though it was, but because that gesture looked like the possibility of a reunion. Sometimes wood says things no apology can hold. That delivery felt like we'd aired out the shop without opening the windows. Hearing about it, Ruben brought bread and coffee and reminded us this craft isn't a straight line toward utility. It's a path that runs along other people's lives and, when it does with respect, leaves a mark that doesn't need signatures. In noisy times, that reminder is gold. That night, before rolling down the gate, I picked up the recorder for the first time since stashing it away. I didn't turn it on. I slipped it into a heavier envelope, wrapped it in paper, wrote a date on it, and placed it in a makeshift safe with a few documents. It wasn't a trophy or a burning secret. It was a period and a new paragraph. Choosing not to listen to some things is also a way to listen to yourself. As months passed, my family's messages changed tone. The old mockery turned into careful silences or timid questions about finishes and woods. A few cousins asked for quotes like any other customer, with no family discount, and I answered with the same seriousness as with anyone else. I learned dignity also charges full price. My mother visited the shop on a sunny Tuesday. She walked slowly between benches and clamps, stroked a freshly waxed console, and said the smell felt like an old home, the kind they don't make anymore. She didn't apologize, and I didn't expect her to. We talked about Ernesto, his patience, how he taught without rushing, And about the toolbox my father put in my hands one day with a gesture I understand better now. Sometimes time rearranges sentences that sounded discordant when we first heard them. With Yvonne, things settled into cordial distance. We'd cross paths at family gatherings where nobody made jokes about Legos or hamburgers anymore. If I ever felt the urge to ask for explanations, I let it pass like a splinter that doesn't bother you. Better not to cut the skin to pull it out. I preferred to focus on projects that demanded my full attention. Laura and I started training 2 apprentices. We gave them the same mantra that holds us up. Listen to the wood, respect time, measure twice, cut once, embrace patience, mistrust hurry, and understand that every visible knot can be a point of beauty. They learned with wide eyes, and in their reflection, we remembered our own beginnings. At night, I'd allow myself a moment to imagine the shop 10 years from now. I didn't see it bigger or louder. I saw it clearer in its choices. Fewer commissions, better processes, clients who value, hands that are grateful. That vision already felt like a kind of heritage, one that doesn't need wills or tense meetings. Just keep tuning the ear. One day, while applying a final coat of wax to a round table, a text came from a familiar number, Rodrigo. He wrote, laconic, that his mother's table was still perfect and that, against all odds, it had hosted conversations less abrasive than expected. He thanked me for the leg design, which left enough space to avoid knee bumps during awkward moments. I stared at the phone for a long time before tucking it back in the drawer without replying. Some thanks are accepted in silence. That same week, a client recommended by Ruben came by. She wanted a desk to write letters to people she'd lost touch with. She wanted kind wood that wouldn't distract, an edge that wouldn't mark her forearms after hours of ink. We designed one with a serene top and a hidden drawer for what you don't want in sight, but don't want forgotten either. Building her a refuge for words was a pleasure. Over time, social media stopped being a display case of novelties and became a living archive of process. We posted less, but better. People commented with stories about their own furniture and the mealtime conversations that changed them. Messages started arriving from kids wanting to repair their grandparents' tables, couples seeking more generous chairs, friends who reconciled in the shadow of a bookcase. That exchange kept us going more than once. Laura suggested a small, invite-only show at the shop, where each piece had, next to its spec sheet, a short text about the conversation it was meant to hold. Few people came, attentive, curious, ready to touch, ask, listen. Ruben talked bevels. One client about her grandmother. A young man fell in love with a grain that looked like a river. That night, I slept sure what heritage was on the right path. I ended the week visiting the old storage where we keep special slabs. I ran my hand over the Perota we never used and the oak waiting its turn. I caught myself whispering like I used to, promising patience and good treatment. I realized that despite everything, or maybe because of it, I'd returned, unafraid, to the starting point, the wood, the table, the people, the voices that find a place. People sometimes ask if I laugh now at those who laughed then. Truth is, I don't. At first, there was a quiet chuckle, the kind you let out after surviving a storm and drying off in silence. But over time, that laugh turned into something else. Conscious calm that doesn't need vindication. The most elegant revenge is a well-made table that lasts decades, not a clever retort that lasts a minute. When I think about that beginning, Christmas dinner, lines that cut deeper than a dull chisel. I also remember the hours when no one was watching, standing in the kitchen with the cold for company. That's where I learned steady work makes less noise than ridicule, but holds up better. And that real inheritance doesn't come wrapped in notarized papers, but in habits that stand the test of time. Teresa never called again. I didn't expect her to. Her son sent those sober messages I kept, not filed away, but in my heart. Yvonne walks differently now, like someone who's learned to measure his own shadow. My mother visits sometimes and asks about knots and grain as if talking about old friends. Laura and I keep tending the shop like a garden that doesn't bloom often, but always right on time. To those who knock asking for work with need disguised as urgency, I listen without resentment and tell the truth. We don't sell life preservers here. We build small boats for very real storms. Sometimes we have openings, sometimes we don't. When we do, they come with the same demands that brought us here. Punctuality, respect for the grain, patience for the oil to cure, loyalty to the table where we speak, and where we stay quiet. I still believe I don't build furniture for my family or for those who doubted me. I build legacies for people who trust before they see and who are willing to sit and talk about what others prefer to break. If I close my eyes right now, I can hear Perota breathing again under fresh wax. And in that sound, there's a simple promise. As long as my hands have a pulse and my ear remembers how it speaks, Wood Heritage will keep building places where time finally sits well. Remember, if you like these stories, subscribe to the channel and ring the bell.